My name is Dolores Stewart. I'm 72 years old, and my daughter Amber just served me yesterday's cold pot roast, while her book club friends dined on perfectly grilled prime rib at my own mahogany dining table. What she didn't know was that those leftovers she deemed good enough for me represented exactly what she'd inherit from my $30 million literary fortune. Sometimes justice has a sense of irony, and sometimes that irony comes with a bestseller's bank account behind it. The smell hit me first as I descended the stairs of the Tudor mansion I'd bought with royalties from my mystery series. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. That intoxicating aroma of perfectly seasoned beef, mingling with roasted garlic and fresh herbs. For a moment, my heart lifted thinking Amber had finally decided to include me in one of her elaborate dinner parties. After 18 months of being treated like an inconvenient houseguest in my own home, perhaps things were changing. I should have known better. I found her in my kitchen, the gourmet space I'd designed after my breakthrough novel, Shadows of Deception, hit the New York Times bestseller list for 47 consecutive weeks. She stood at my imported Italian marble island, wearing my late husband Henry's favorite apron like it was her own, carefully plating what looked like restaurant-quality cuisine onto my finest bone china. The kitchen island where Henry and I used to discuss plot twists over morning coffee was now covered with her things, vitamin bottles, mail addressed to her at my address, and a stack of interior design magazines that made my stomach turn every time I saw them. "Oh, you're back from your walk," she said, without turning around, her voice carrying that particular tone people use when they're trying to sound pleasant while clearly wishing you weren't there. "I made you a plate. It's the leftover pot roast from yesterday's dinner." I looked at the sad little portion she gestured toward. The meat was dry and dark around the edges, sitting in a pool of congealed gravy on one of the chipped plates I'd relegated to the donation pile months ago. Beside it sat a plastic fork, the kind you get with takeout, and a paper napkin that had already absorbed some questionable moisture from the sad excuse for a meal. This was what she considered appropriate for me, the woman who had opened her doors to Amber's entire social circle, who had welcomed her book club meetings, her charity committee gatherings, and her endless stream of friends who treated my home like their personal entertainment venue. I was the New York Times best-selling author who had built this literary empire word by word, page by page, book by book. My mystery novels had sold over 15 million copies worldwide, been translated into 32 languages, and earned me enough money to buy this mansion outright, while setting aside a fortune that could fund small countries. "Where's everyone else eating?" I asked, though the sounds from my dining room already provided the answer. Laughter, the gentle clink of real silverware against real plates, the pop of what sounded like a very expensive wine cork. "The book club is having our monthly gourmet meeting in the dining room," Amber said, finally turning to face me with a smile that never reached her eyes. "We're discussing literary cuisine tonight, you know, food scenes from famous novels. I thought you might be more comfortable eating in here anyway. You know how you get overwhelmed when there's too much intellectual discussion about contemporary literature, how I get overwhelmed. How I get overwhelmed discussing literature in my own home, when I'm the one who actually wrote literature that millions of people read worldwide. How I get overwhelmed by intellectual discussion, when I held a master's degree in English literature from Columbia, and had been a guest lecturer at universities across the country. I picked up my plate of sad leftovers, and followed the sound of animated conversation to my dining room, where I found them seated around my custom-made mahogany table, like they were hosting their own private literary salon. 8 women I'd welcomed into my home countless times, wearing their evening clothes and raising glasses of what I recognized as the bottle of 1982 Bordeaux I'd been saving for a truly special occasion. They were cutting into perfectly prepared prime rib, the meat so tender it practically melted under their knives. Each plate was artfully arranged with roasted vegetables that still glistened with herbs and truffle oil, accompanied by what looked like individually crafted Yorkshire puddings. The table was set with my grandmother's silver, the Waterford crystal Henry had given me for our 25th anniversary, in cloth napkins I'd embroidered by hand during the long winter evenings after his funeral. "Dolores," called Courtney Archer, Amber's book club president, raising her wine glass in my direction. How wonderful that you could join us. We're discussing the dinner party scene from The Great Gatsby tonight. Such sophisticated food symbolism, though I suppose you might find Fitzgerald a bit challenging to follow. I stood there holding my plate of yesterday's dried-out pot roast, still wearing my walking shoes and light jacket that no one had invited me to remove, while they sat in their designer clothes around a table laden with food that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. These women were discussing symbolism in literature, while treating the woman who had actually created literary symbols that critics analyzed in graduate courses like an elderly relative who needed to be humored. "That's wonderful," I said, and I meant it in more ways than they could imagine. I was genuinely fascinated to watch this performance unfold, the casual way they'd arranged themselves in my space while serving me scraps, discussing literature while dismissing the actual author in their midst. The conversation resumed as if I weren't there, their voices mixing with the clink of silverware in a soundtrack of intellectual pretension that somehow didn't include the person whose books had actually been studied in literature courses worldwide. And that's when I made the decision that would change everything, not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of a crystal clear understanding that sometimes the most powerful plot twist is the one nobody sees coming. Sometimes the best mysteries are the ones where the victim writes the ending. Amber gestured toward a small space they'd left between two chairs at the far end of the table, barely wide enough for one of the kitchen stools they'd brought in to accommodate their growing dinner parties. No place setting, no wine glass, just a narrow slice of space where I could squeeze in with my leftover dinner and watch them feast on cuisine prepared with my money in my house. I sat down and took a bite of the pot roast. It was cold in the center, over-salted from sitting too long, and had the texture of leather that had been left in the sun. Around me, the conversation flowed as if I were invisible. Courtney was pontificating about symbolism in modern literature, gesturing with her fork as she made points about character development that would have been laughable if they weren't so painfully incorrect. "The key to understanding contemporary fiction," she announced with the authority of someone who'd never actually written a word for publication, "is recognizing how authors use food as metaphor. When a character is served inferior food, it represents their diminished status in society." The irony was so thick, I could have cut it with one of my own kitchen knives. Here I sat, eating literal leftovers, while the woman lecturing about literary metaphors enjoyed prime rib that I had unknowingly funded. If I had written this scene in one of my novels, my editor would have called it too heavy-handed. "Absolutely brilliant observation," gushed Bridget Sanders, another book club regular, who'd been frequenting my home for the better part of a year. "It's so refreshing to discuss literature with people who truly understand the nuances. Not like those amateur readers who just skim for plot. Amateur readers." I watched her cut another piece of my prime rib while dismissing the very audience that had made my career possible. The millions of amateur readers who had bought my books, attended my signings, and made my literary success a reality, were apparently beneath the intellectual consideration of women who met monthly to discuss books they half understood over expensive dinners they didn't pay for. "Speaking of plot," Amber interjected, refilling wine glasses with practiced ease, "has anyone read that dreadful new mystery series everyone's talking about, Death in the Garden or something equally pedestrian? The writing is so formulaic. No artistic merit whatsoever." I nearly choked on my dry pot roast. Death in the Garden was my latest series, the one that had just secured a 7-figure television adaptation deal. The one that critics had called a masterpiece of psychological suspense and the most innovative mystery writing in a generation. The series that had spent 6 months at the top of every bestseller list and had already been optioned for international distribution. "Oh, I couldn't agree more," said another book club member, whose name I'd forgotten despite hosting her in my home dozens of times. "These commercial mystery writers have no understanding of true literary craft. They just throw together formulaic plots for the masses. Real literature requires so much more sophistication. Real literature, commercial mystery writers." I was listening to my own success being dismissed as literary trash by women who were literally eating food purchased with the royalties from that formulaic work. The cognitive dissonance was staggering, but it was also illuminating. They didn't just see me as an inconvenience in my own home, they had no idea who I actually was. Mother has always been fascinated by those types of books. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Amber said with the patronizing tone people use when discussing a child's interest in picture books. She reads them constantly. I keep telling her she should try something more challenging, but you know how it is with older readers. They get set in their preferences. Older readers who get set in their preferences. I was the author of those books she was dismissing so casually. I had created the characters they were criticizing, crafted the plots they found formulaic, built the literary worlds they considered beneath their intellectual consideration. And my own daughter was using my reading habits as evidence of my supposed intellectual limitations. It's sweet that she has her little hobby, Courtney added with the kind of smile people give to children who collect rocks. Reading is such good mental exercise for seniors, keeps the mind active even if it's not particularly challenging material. Mental exercise for seniors. Little hobby. I had been nominated for the Edgar Award 3 times, won the Anthony Award twice, and had been inducted into the Mystery Writers of America Hall of Fame. Universities taught courses on my work. Graduate students wrote dissertations analyzing my narrative techniques. International conferences featured panels dedicated to my contributions to the genre, but to these women I was just an elderly woman with simple tastes who needed mental stimulation to keep from going senile. The conversation continued around me, a symphony of intellectual superiority performed by an audience that had no idea they were critiquing the composer. They discussed character development techniques I had pioneered, plot structures I had perfected, and literary themes I had explored in depth, all while dismissing the very author who had created them. As I sat there picking at my congealed leftovers, listening to my life's work being systematically diminished by people who couldn't write a grocery list without making grammatical errors, I felt something fundamental shift inside my chest. Not anger, exactly, but a crystalline clarity that cut through years of trying to be the accommodating mother, the gracious hostess, the elderly woman who should be grateful for whatever consideration she received. They weren't just serving me leftovers. They were treating my entire existence as leftover, something to be used up, pushed aside, and ultimately discarded when it was no longer convenient. My literary legacy, my financial success, my intellectual achievements, even my basic dignity as a human being, had all been reduced to something they could dismiss with patronizing smiles and condescending comments about age-appropriate entertainment. That night, after they had finally departed in their luxury cars, leaving me to clean up the remnants of their feast while they headed home to houses they could afford, because of careers built on social connections, rather than actual talent, I made a decision that would have made my mystery novel protagonists proud. If they wanted to treat me like a minor character in my own life story, then perhaps it was time to show them how a real plot twist works. The revelation didn't come all at once, like the best mystery plots. It unfolded gradually through a series of seemingly unconnected incidents that eventually formed a pattern too obvious to ignore. Over the following weeks, I began observing my own household with the detached curiosity of a novelist researching character motivations, and what I discovered would have made excellent material for a psychological thriller if it weren't my own life being dissected. The morning after the book club dinner, I found Amber in my home office, seated behind the mahogany desk, where I'd written 17 best-selling novels. She was speaking into her phone with the casual authority of someone conducting business, surrounded by my first edition books and the awards I'd accumulated over 3 decades of literary success. "No, I completely understand the market conditions," she was saying, her manicured fingers drumming against the leather desk pad, where I'd signed countless book contracts. "But we're highly motivated sellers, and timing is flexible, since the current owner is looking to downsize anyway." Current owner looking to downsize. I stood frozen in my own doorway, listening to my daughter describe my living situation to what was obviously a real estate agent, as if my relocation was already a settled matter, rather than something that had never been discussed, let alone agreed upon. She looked up and saw me standing there, her face flushing with the guilty embarrassment of someone caught in the middle of something they knew was inappropriate. She quickly wrapped up the call with vague promises to be in touch soon. then turned to face me with a smile that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts. "Oh, hi Mom," she said, closing the leather portfolio she'd been writing in. My portfolio, the one Henry had given me when my first book was published. "I was just doing some preliminary research. You know how I like to be prepared for everything." "Research for what, exactly?" I asked, though we both knew the answer. "Well," she said, straightening the papers she'd been reviewing, papers that I now realized were real estate listings. "Tobias and I have been talking, and with the baby coming, we're going to need more space. This house is really designed for a large family, and it seems like such a waste for just one person." Just one person. As if the 3 adults and soon-to-be 4 family members currently living in my house constituted a smaller household than my solitary presence. As if my 30 years of residence here carried less weight than their 18 months of occupation. "I thought we could look at some lovely senior communities," she continued, her voice taking on the bright enthusiasm people use when they're trying to sell something they know the other person doesn't want. "Places designed specifically for people your age, with activities and social opportunities. You'd make so many new friends to replace the life I was being asked to abandon. Activities to fill the time I would no longer spend in my own home. Social opportunities to substitute for the family gatherings I would no longer host." She was painting my displacement as a lifestyle upgrade, my eviction as a social enhancement. That afternoon, while Amber was out shopping for baby furniture with my credit card, a detail I'd discovered when reviewing my monthly statements, I decided to explore my own house with fresh eyes. What I found was even more disturbing than her real estate research. My master bedroom had been systematically colonized. Tobias's clothes hung in my walk-in closet alongside Amber's maternity wardrobe. His toiletries filled my bathroom counter. Their personal photographs had replaced mine on the nightstand, where I'd kept pictures of Henry for the 5 years since his death. They hadn't asked permission for any of these intrusions. They'd simply expanded their presence until my own bedroom felt like a guest room in my own home. The basement, which I'd converted into a library and writing retreat, had been transformed into a makeshift nursery planning center. Paint samples were taped to the walls. I'd carefully designed to house my research materials. Baby furniture catalogs covered the antique writing desk where I'd penned my first novel. Boxes of infant supplies occupied the reading nook where I'd spent countless hours crafting the mysteries that had built our financial security. But the most devastating discovery came when I found the letter. It was tucked inside one of the baby planning binders, written in Amber's careful handwriting and addressed to her college friend who worked in real estate development. The letter outlined a comprehensive timeline for my relocation, complete with target dates for listing the house, projected sale prices, and detailed plans for how they intended to renovate my home once I was settled elsewhere. "The house that represents so much wasted space and inefficient use of prime real estate," she had written. "Once Mom is in a more appropriate living situation, we can finally update this place to reflect modern family needs. The old-fashioned decor and dated layout really don't work for contemporary lifestyles." Old-fashioned decor, dated layout. She was describing the home I'd carefully designed and lovingly furnished over 3 decades, dismissing my aesthetic choices as obstacles to their renovation plans. The Tudor mansion I'd purchased at the height of my career success, the place where I'd written my most acclaimed novels, the sanctuary Henry and I had created together, all of it was just inefficient use of prime real estate that needed to be updated once I was no longer there to clutter it up with my presence. But it was the final paragraph that revealed the true scope of their planning. "Mom's literary career is essentially over anyway. Mystery novels are such a declining market, and her last few books haven't performed as well as the earlier ones. She's really just living off past success at this point. It makes much more sense for the house to serve a growing family that can actually make use of all this space." Past success. Declining market. Living off old achievements. My most recent novel had debuted at number 2 on the New York Times bestseller list just 6 months earlier. The television adaptation of my series was scheduled to premiere next fall with a marketing budget larger than most people's annual salaries. I had 3 more books under contract with my publisher, an international book tour planned for next spring, and royalty checks that still arrived monthly in amounts that could fund small businesses. But to my daughter, I was a has-been author clinging to outdated relevance, occupying space that could be better utilized by people with actual futures ahead of them. That evening, I sat in my library, surrounded by the evidence of a career they'd already declared dead, holding the letter that outlined their plans for my displacement. For the first time in months, I felt the familiar thrill that came at the beginning of plotting a new mystery novel. That moment, when all the pieces start falling into place, and you realize exactly how the story needs to end. They wanted to treat me like a minor character in my own life story. They wanted to edit me out of the narrative entirely. Well, as any experienced mystery writer knows, the most satisfying plot twists are the ones where the supposed victim turns out to be the one controlling the story all along. The next morning, I made the phone call that would change everything. Not in anger, not in haste, but with the same methodical precision I brought to plotting my novels. Every great mystery requires careful planning, meticulous attention to detail, and a thorough understanding of all the characters' motivations. This particular story would be no exception. Lewis Rudd Law Offices came the familiar voice of the receptionist, who had handled my legal affairs for over 2 decades. "This is Dolores Stewart," I said, settling into the chair in my home office, where I'd conceived plots that had captivated millions of readers. "I need to schedule an appointment with Louis. It's regarding some significant changes to my estate planning." Lewis Rudd had been more than my attorney. He'd been the legal architect of my literary empire. He'd negotiated my publishing contracts, structured my business entities, and helped me navigate the complex financial landscape that came with sudden wealth. More importantly, he was one of the few people who truly understood the scope of what I'd built over 3 decades of writing. "Of course, Mrs. Stewart," the receptionist replied. "Is everything all right? This sounds rather urgent." "Everything is exactly as it should be," I said, which was true in ways she couldn't imagine. "I just need to ensure my affairs are properly arranged." "Could we meet this afternoon?" 2 hours later, I sat across from Lewis in his downtown office, surrounded by law books and family photographs that reminded me of the life I'd had before my home became a battlefield for control. Lewis was in his early 60s, distinguished and sharp-eyed, with the kind of practical wisdom that came from decades of helping people navigate life's complexities. "Tell me what's on your mind, Dolores," he said, settling back in his leather chair with the patient attention of someone who'd heard every possible family drama over his career. I explained the situation as objectively as I could: the gradual takeover of my home, the dismissal of my career achievements, the secret planning for my displacement that I'd discovered in my own house. Lewis listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on the legal pad in front of him, his expression growing more serious as I detailed the extent of their presumptions. "They're planning to sell my house," I concluded, "and they're discussing my literary legacy as if it's already over. They've moved into my bedroom, converted my writing retreat into their nursery planning center, and they're treating me like an elderly woman who should be grateful for whatever consideration they provide." Lewis was quiet for a long moment, studying the notes he'd taken. "Dolores," he said finally, "what do you want to accomplish with your estate planning? Are we talking about modifications to ensure your comfort, or are we discussing more significant changes?" "I want to create a will that reflects the same level of consideration they've shown me," I said. "If they believe my life's work is worth leftovers, then their inheritance should reflect that same valuation." Over the next hour, we worked out the details of what would become my masterpiece, not a novel this time, but a legal document that would serve justice with the precision of a perfectly plotted mystery. The new will would leave the bulk of my estate to the Literacy Foundation, an organization that promoted reading programs in underserved communities. It was a cause that had always been close to my heart, representing everything my daughter's book club pretended to value, but had never actually supported. "How much are we talking about for the family?" Lewis asked as we reviewed the numbers. 1%, I said, without hesitation. "The same proportion of respect they've shown my contributions to their comfortable lifestyle." Lewis raised an eyebrow. 1% of $30 million is still 300,000. "That's not exactly poverty. It's not about the amount," I explained. "It's about the proportion. They've been serving me the leftover portions of my own life, while they feast on the main course. Their inheritance should reflect exactly what they think I'm worth." The beauty of the plan was its mathematical perfection. Amber and Tobias had been living as if they were entitled to my entire estate, making plans based on the assumption that my death would solve all their financial concerns and provide them with the lifestyle they believed they deserved. Instead, they would receive exactly what their behavior had earned them, a small portion, enough to survive, but not enough to maintain the luxury they'd grown accustomed to on my dime. "There's one more thing," I said, as we finalized the documents. "I want to include a letter explaining my reasoning, not for legal purposes, but for clarity. I want them to understand the connection between their treatment of me and what they're receiving." Lewis nodded approvingly. "An ethical will. It's becoming more common. People want to leave explanations along with their bequests. What kind of message do you want to convey?" "That actions have consequences," I said. "That treating someone like leftovers means you inherit leftovers. That genuine respect can't be retroactively applied when it becomes convenient." We spent another hour crafting the letter, carefully worded to avoid any language that could be construed as vindictive, while clearly explaining the proportional relationship between their behavior and their inheritance. The letter would make it impossible for them to claim they didn't understand why their windfall had become a trickle. "I have to ask," Lewis said, as we wrapped up our meeting. "Are you certain about this? Estate planning decisions made in emotional circumstances sometimes feel different later." "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," I replied. "This isn't an emotional decision, it's a logical one. They've shown me exactly what they think I'm worth. I'm simply giving them the same level of consideration in return." That evening, I returned home to find Amber and Tobias in my living room, reviewing baby name books while discussing nursery themes. They looked up when I entered, both wearing the casual expressions of people who felt completely secure in their future plans. "How was your day, Mom?" Amber asked with the polite interest people show when they're not really listening for the answer. "Very productive," I said, settling into my favorite chair with the satisfaction of someone who had just put the perfect ending on a particularly complex plot. "I got a lot of important writing done today. If only they knew exactly what kind of story I'd been working on." The campaign to relocate me intensified over the following weeks with the systematic precision of a military operation. What had once been subtle hints and occasional suggestions transformed into a coordinated effort that would have impressed me if it weren't so transparent. Amber approached my displacement like a project manager tackling a particularly challenging assignment, complete with timelines, research materials, and carefully rehearsed talking points. It began with the brochures. Glossy pamphlets for luxury senior communities started appearing throughout my house like literary breadcrumbs, leading toward my inevitable exile. I found them on my nightstand, tucked between my morning newspapers, slipped into the books I was reading. Each one featured smiling elderly residents engaged in activities designed to suggest that leaving your home was actually an upgrade to a more fulfilling lifestyle. "Golden Sunset Manor, where every day is a new adventure," proclaimed one brochure that materialized on my kitchen counter. The photographs showed elderly people painting watercolors, playing bridge, and attending lecture series with the kind of manufactured joy typically associated with pharmaceutical advertisements. "Independent living for today's active seniors. I thought you might find this interesting," Amber said, when I discovered her placing another brochure next to my coffee cup one morning. "They have a wonderful library, and they host author visits every month. I thought you'd enjoy meeting other book lovers." Other book lovers. As if the woman who had created beloved characters read by millions worldwide needed to be introduced to people who enjoyed reading as a hobby. The condescension was breathtaking in its casual cruelty. "They even have a writing group," she continued, her voice brightening with false enthusiasm. "You could share your little stories with people who'd really appreciate them." Little stories. My 17 novels, which had collectively earned over $50 million and been translated into 32 languages, had been reduced to little stories that I could share with fellow residents as a recreational activity. The dismissal was so complete, so effortlessly devastating, that I almost admired its efficiency. The brochures were followed by surprise visits. Amber began scheduling tours of senior communities without consulting me, presenting these expeditions as spontaneous opportunities that were too good to pass up. "Since we're already out running errands," she would say, "why don't we just pop in and take a quick look? We don't have to make any decisions today." The first facility was everything the brochures had promised: immaculate, well-staffed and designed to make aging seem like a luxurious vacation. The director, A woman named Courtney, who shared the book club president's name and similarly patronizing demeanor, gave us a comprehensive tour while highlighting amenities that were supposed to make me forget I was being asked to abandon my home. "We have a wonderful community here," she explained, as we walked through corridors decorated with generic artwork and motivational sayings. "Our residents often tell us they wish they'd made the move sooner. There's something so liberating about not having to worry about home maintenance and property taxes." Home maintenance and property taxes. The implication was that I was struggling with responsibilities beyond my capabilities, rather than choosing to maintain the house where I'd built my career and shared 30 years of marriage with Henry. They were reframing my competence as burden, my independence as foolish stubbornness. "The dining room serves restaurant-quality meals 3 times a day," the director continued, leading us into a space that looked like a hotel banquet hall. "No more grocery shopping or cooking. Our residents love the convenience. No more cooking in the kitchen where Henry and I had shared morning coffee while discussing plot points. No more preparing meals for friends who appreciated both my hospitality and my literary achievements. No more control over when, what, or how I ate." They were selling the elimination of choice as liberation from responsibility, but it was the writing room that revealed the true scope of their misunderstanding about who I was and what I'd accomplished. The space was a small corner of the library, equipped with a few outdated computers and a shelf of basic reference books. "This is where our creative residents work on their memoirs and family histories," the director explained with the enthusiasm people reserve for describing children's art projects. "We have some very talented writers here." One gentleman just finished a fascinating account of his experiences in the Korean War. Memoirs and family histories, war stories and personal reminiscences. They were showing me a space designed for elderly people documenting their past experiences, not for professional authors creating new work. In their minds, my writing career was already over. I was just another old person who might enjoy scribbling down memories to share with other residents. "Isn't this perfect for you, Mom?" Amber asked, her voice filled with the kind of performative excitement people use when they're trying to convince themselves as much as their audience. "You could write your own memoir. I bet people would love to hear about your experiences in the publishing industry." Experiences in the publishing industry. Past tense. Historical perspective. She was speaking about my career as if it were something that had ended rather than an ongoing source of income that funded her comfortable lifestyle. The woman whose latest novel was currently being adapted for television was being encouraged to write her memoirs for the entertainment of nursing home residents. The pressure intensified when we returned home. Amber had apparently interpreted our tour as evidence of my interest rather than my polite tolerance of her manipulations. Over dinner that evening, another meal where I was served reheated leftovers while she and Tobias enjoyed fresh cuisine, she launched into an enthusiastic review of everything the facility had to offer. "The social opportunities alone would be worth the move," she said, cutting into what looked like perfectly prepared salmon while I picked at yesterday's casserole. "You'd have built-in friends who share your interests. No more sitting alone in that big house feeling isolated. Sitting alone feeling isolated." The characterization of my solitary time as loneliness rather than the precious solitude every writer needs to create. The house where I'd produced my most successful work was being reframed as a prison of isolation rather than a sanctuary of creativity. "And think about the practical benefits," Tobias added, speaking up for the first time in weeks. "No more worrying about yard work or repairs or any of that homeowner stress. You could just focus on enjoying yourself." Enjoying myself. As if the act of maintaining the home I'd chosen, caring for the garden Henry and I had planted together, and preserving the space where my literary legacy had been born, was some kind of burden rather than a source of meaning and purpose. They had taken my life and rewritten it as a story of limitation, isolation, and burden. In their narrative, I was an elderly woman struggling with responsibilities beyond her capabilities, clinging to an outdated lifestyle that no longer served her needs. They had transformed my choice to remain in my home into evidence of my inability to make rational decisions about my own welfare. But what they didn't understand was that I was writing a different story entirely, one where the seemingly powerless character possessed resources they never suspected, and where their assumptions about my limitations would become the foundation of their own downfall. The confrontation came on a rainy Thursday morning in October, 3 weeks after their coordinated campaign to relocate me had reached fever pitch. I was sitting in my library, reviewing the latest royalty statements from my publisher, figures that would have shocked Amber if she'd bothered to ask about my current financial situation rather than assuming my career was over, when she appeared in the doorway with an expression I'd learned to recognize as her difficult conversation face. "Mom, we need to talk," she said, settling into the chair across from my writing desk without waiting for an invitation. "Tobias and I have made a decision that we think will be best for everyone, best for everyone." I'd learned to be wary of that phrase, especially when it came from Amber, because in my experience it usually meant best for Amber while being presented as a universal good. "Golden Sunset Manor has an opening," she continued, her voice taking on the bright enthusiasm of someone delivering what they consider to be wonderful news. "They rarely have cancellations, but someone had to relocate unexpectedly, and they're willing to hold the apartment for us until next week. It's a beautiful unit on the 3rd floor with lovely garden views. They're willing to hold the apartment for us," as if this decision involved mutual consultation rather than unilateral planning, as if my agreement was assumed rather than required. "When were you planning to discuss this with me?" I asked, setting down the royalty statement I'd been reviewing, a document showing income that exceeded most people's annual salaries for a single quarter. "We're discussing it now," she said, her smile flickering slightly as she registered something unexpected in my tone. "I know change is difficult at your age, but this really is the perfect solution. You'll have your own space, we'll have room for our growing family, and everyone will be happier. At your age, perfect solution, everyone will be happier." Each phrase landed like a small explosion, revealing the extent to which she'd convinced herself that my displacement was actually a kindness she was providing rather than a convenience she was demanding. "And what if I'm not interested in this perfect solution?" I asked. For a moment, her carefully constructed enthusiasm faltered. She'd clearly expected this conversation to follow a predictable script. Grateful acceptance, perhaps some token resistance, that could be overcome with reassurance, and ultimately compliance with the plans she'd made on my behalf. "I don't understand," she said, though her tone suggested she understood perfectly and didn't like where this was heading. "We've looked at several facilities together. You seemed interested." "I was being polite," I said. "There's a difference between being interested and being courteous to someone who's clearly invested significant time and research I never requested." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. For months I'd been accommodating, accepting, and quietly enduring their systematic takeover of my life. The idea that I might refuse to participate in my own displacement had apparently never occurred to her. "Mom," she said, her voice taking on the patient tone people use when they think they're dealing with someone who's being unreasonable, "this house is really too big for one person. The maintenance, the expenses, the isolation. It's not healthy for someone your age to be rattling around in all this space." "What if I told you I had no intention of moving anywhere?" I asked. "What if I said I was perfectly happy in my own home and planned to stay here for the rest of my life?" Her face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and finally something that looked like barely controlled frustration. "That's not really practical," she said. "We need space for the baby, and this house has so much room that's just going to waste. It makes sense for you to downsize while we're expanding our family." Makes sense. Going to waste. The cold calculation in her language was breathtaking. My home had been reduced to a resource allocation problem that needed to be solved efficiently, with my preferences being irrelevant to the equation. "Actually," I said, standing up and walking to the window that overlooked the garden Henry and I had designed together, "I have a different proposal. What if you and Tobias were the ones who relocated?" The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a fire neither of us had expected. When I turned back toward her, Amber's face had gone pale, her mouth slightly open as she processed the implications of what I'd just said. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is our home now. We've been living here for over a year. The baby's room is already planned. Our entire life is built around this house. Our home now. Our entire life." The possessive language revealed everything about how she'd come to view my property and my life. In her mind, my house had already become theirs, My displacement was just a formality that needed to be completed to make the transition official. Interesting perspective, I said, returning to my chair and picking up the royalty statement I'd been reviewing. Though I should point out that my name is still on the deed, my money still pays the mortgage that doesn't exist because I own this house outright, and my income still funds the lifestyle you've both grown accustomed to. For the first time in our conversation, she seemed to really look at what I was holding. Her eyes focused on the publisher's letterhead, the official financial figures, the evidence that my supposedly defunct career was still generating substantial income. "I had no idea you were still," she began, then stopped herself before completing the thought. "Still what?" "Still working, still earning, still relevant in an industry you've dismissed as formulaic and beneath intellectual consideration," I asked. "I'm curious about what you thought was funding your comfortable lifestyle, if my career was as over as you've been telling people." The realization was dawning on her face like sunrise over a crime scene. For months, she'd been dismissing my work while enjoying the financial benefits of my success. She'd been planning my displacement while depending entirely on my income for her security. She'd been treating me like a burden while I was literally the foundation supporting her entire way of life. "Mom, I didn't mean," she started, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Here's my counter-proposal," I said, with the calm precision I brought to plotting particularly complex mysteries. "You and Tobias can continue living here under the same conditions I've been enjoying. You can eat the leftover portions while I enjoy fresh meals. You can use the kitchen stools while I sit at my own dining table. You can sleep in the guest room while I reclaim my bedroom, and you can contribute to household expenses proportional to the respect you've shown me." She stared at me as if I'd started speaking in a foreign language. The idea that I might have power in my own home, that I might be capable of setting conditions rather than accepting them, had never entered her calculations. "Or," I continued, "you can make your own arrangements for housing that better suits your growing family's needs. I'm sure there are lovely apartments available for people living on a single income without family support." The choice I was offering was crystal clear: accept the same treatment they'd been giving me, or leave entirely. No more gradual takeover disguised as family harmony. No more assumption that my resources were theirs to manage. No more treating me like an inconvenience in my own life. The look on her face told me she finally understood that the story she thought she was writing had just taken a very unexpected turn. What followed my ultimatum was the most convincing performance I'd witnessed since my last Broadway show. Within hours of our confrontation, Amber had transformed from entitled daughter-in-law to devoted caregiver, demonstrating a remarkable range that would have impressed professional actors. If I hadn't been the target of her manipulation, I might have applauded the sheer artistry of her sudden character change. The first sign of her new approach came that very evening. I walked into my kitchen to find her preparing what looked like a restaurant-quality dinner, complete with perfectly seared duck breast, roasted vegetables that actually appeared to be fresh, and a wine pairing that suggested she'd consulted more than just the price tag when making her selection. "I thought we could have a proper family dinner tonight," she said, turning to face me with a smile that seemed almost genuine. I realized I haven't been putting enough effort into making our meals special. After all, food is one of the most important ways we show care for each other. Food as a way to show care. The irony was so thick I could have served it as dessert. The same woman who had spent months feeding me congealed leftovers while she dined on prime rib was now lecturing me about the emotional significance of cuisine. But the performance was thorough. She'd set my dining table with my good china, arranged fresh flowers in my crystal vase, and even lit candles in the silver holders that had been wedding gifts from Henry's family. The place settings were properly arranged, with real silverware and cloth napkins that showed no signs of having absorbed questionable moisture from reheated meals. "This looks lovely," I said, taking my usual seat and noting that for the first time in months, I wasn't being relegated to a kitchen stool squeezed between other chairs. "What's the occasion?" "No special occasion," she replied, serving me a portion of duck that was not only fresh but perfectly prepared. "I just wanted to show you how much I appreciate everything you do for us. I know I haven't always been as thoughtful as I should have been. Haven't always been as thoughtful." It was a gentle way of describing months of systematic mistreatment, but at least it was an acknowledgement that something had been wrong. The duck was excellent, prepared with herbs I recognized from my own garden, and cooked to exactly the temperature I preferred. It was the kind of meal that required genuine effort and attention to detail. Over the following weeks, the transformation continued with impressive consistency. Amber began consulting me about household decisions, asking my opinion about everything from grocery purchases to furniture arrangements. She started including me in conversations about the baby's room, seeking my advice about color schemes and nursery layouts, with the deference of someone who genuinely valued my input. The book club meetings underwent a particularly dramatic revision. Instead of being dismissed to eat leftovers in the kitchen, I found myself invited to join their literary discussions. More remarkably, Amber began introducing me not as her elderly mother-in-law who enjoyed simple reading, but as a published author with actual expertise in the field they were pretending to understand. "Mom has written 17 novels," she announced during one evening when they were discussing mystery fiction. "She's been nominated for several major awards and has insights into the publishing industry that we could all learn from." 17 novels. Major awards. Insights worth learning from. The same achievements she'd been dismissing as formulaic commercial writing were now being presented as credentials worthy of respect. The book club members, who had spent months treating me like an intellectual lightweight, suddenly became eager to hear my opinions about plot structure, character development, and the literary techniques they'd been analyzing so incorrectly. "We'd love to hear your perspective on contemporary mystery writing," Courtney said with what appeared to be genuine interest. "What do you think distinguishes quality work in the genre?" Quality work in the genre. The same genre they'd been dismissing as formulaic entertainment for the masses was now being discussed as if it had legitimate artistic merit. I shared some observations about narrative techniques and thematic development, watching their faces as they realized they were receiving insights from someone who actually knew what she was talking about. The most surprising change came in the form of a handwritten letter I found on my desk one morning. In Amber's careful script, she had composed what appeared to be a heartfelt apology that acknowledged specific instances of her poor treatment and expressed genuine remorse for her behavior. "I know I've been selfish and inconsiderate," the letter read. "I got so focused on what I thought was best for our growing family that I lost sight of what was best for you. This is your home, and you deserve to be treated with the respect and love that someone of your accomplishments has earned. I hope you'll give me the chance to show you that I can be better." The respect and love that someone of your accomplishments has earned. It was exactly what I'd been hoping to hear for months, expressed with what seemed like authentic understanding of what had been missing from our relationship. The letter referenced specific incidents where she'd been dismissive or inconsiderate, suggesting that she'd actually reflected on her behavior, rather than offering generic apology. For nearly a month this new dynamic continued. Amber maintained her respectful treatment, included me in family decisions, and demonstrated the kind of consideration I'd been requesting all along. Tobias followed her lead, engaging me in conversations about literature and showing interest in my writing career that seemed more than merely polite. There were moments when I almost believed the transformation was genuine. When Amber asked for my advice about managing a household budget, sharing concerns about their financial future with what appeared to be real vulnerability, I felt a flicker of the connection I'd hoped we might develop. When she requested my help with a baby registry, genuinely wanting my input about which items were necessities versus luxuries, I saw glimpses of the thoughtful daughter-in-law I'd once imagined she might become. But the test of authenticity came when she thought I wasn't listening. I was in my library one afternoon, working on revisions for my upcoming novel, when I overheard a phone conversation that revealed the true motivation behind her dramatic behavioral change. Amber was speaking to someone in hushed tones, but the old house's acoustics carried her voice clearly through the heating vents. "The whole concerned daughter act is exhausting," she was saying, "but it's working. She's completely bought into the idea that I've changed. I just need to keep it up until after the baby comes, and we can revisit the housing situation from a position of strength." The concerned daughter act. A position of strength. Her month of respectful treatment had been exactly that, an act performed with the specific goal of lulling me into complacency until she could resume her campaign for my displacement with better tactics and timing. The key is making her feel valued and included until she becomes emotionally invested in staying, she continued. Once she's attached to the idea of being a hands-on grandmother, she'll be much more willing to consider housing arrangements that give us more space while keeping her close enough to provide childcare. Emotional investment, housing arrangements, childcare services. She had analyzed my needs and desires like a strategist planning a campaign, identifying my love for my future grandchild as the weakness she could exploit to achieve her goals. My month of renewed hope had been carefully calculated manipulation designed to make me more cooperative when she eventually renewed her pressure for my relocation. As I listened to her outline her strategy for managing me like a difficult client who needed careful handling, I realized that some people don't change, they just get better at hiding who they really are. The performance had been impressive, but it was still just a performance. And now it was time for me to write the final act. The stroke came on a crisp November morning while I was tending to the last of the season's roses in my garden. One moment I was deadheading the final blooms that Henry had planted to celebrate my first bestseller, and the next I was sitting on the stone bench we'd placed beneath the oak tree, struggling to remember how to make my left hand cooperate with my brain's instructions. It wasn't painful, which surprised me. I'd always imagined medical emergencies would come with dramatic symptoms and overwhelming sensations. Instead, this felt like a gentle disconnection, as if someone had quietly unplugged part of my nervous system while I wasn't paying attention. My speech felt thick and unfamiliar in my mouth, and the left side of my face seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Tobias found me there 20 minutes later, when he came looking for me to discuss the baby's birth plan. To his credit, he responded with genuine alarm and efficiency, calling for an ambulance while helping me into the house and gathering the medical information the paramedics would need. For those first crucial minutes, his concern seemed authentic rather than calculated. The hospital stay lasted 5 days, during which I underwent a comprehensive evaluation that revealed what the doctors called a minor stroke with minimal lasting effects. My speech returned to normal within 48 hours, the facial weakness resolved completely, and the hand coordination issues improved steadily with physical therapy. By all medical measures, I'd been remarkably fortunate. But it was during those 5 days that I witnessed the true test of Amber's transformation. The first day, she maintained her recent pattern of attentive care, staying by my bedside and asking thoughtful questions about my comfort and needs. She brought flowers from my own garden, arranged them in a vase she'd purchased specifically for my hospital room, and made sure the nursing staff understood my preferences about everything from room temperature to meal timing. "The important thing is that you focus on getting better," she said, holding my hand with what appeared to be genuine affection. "Don't worry about anything at home. Tobias and I will take care of everything." Take care of everything. At the time, I interpreted this as reassurance about household management and routine maintenance. I didn't realize she meant it as a comprehensive statement about taking control of my life. By the second day, when it became clear that my recovery was progressing well, and I would likely return home with minimal assistance needed, subtle changes began appearing in her demeanor. The concerned daughter-in-law facade remained intact, but underneath I detected a growing restlessness that suggested her plans were being disrupted by my rapid improvement. The revelation came on the third day, when I overheard a conversation between Amber and someone I couldn't identify in the hospital corridor outside my room. I'd been napping when their voices pulled me back to consciousness, and something in Amber's tone made me remain still and listen rather than announcing that I was awake. "The doctors are saying she'll make a full recovery," Amber was saying, her voice carrying a note of frustration that she was trying to suppress. "They're talking about discharging her by the weekend with minimal home care requirements. That's good news, isn't it?" The other voice replied, a woman's voice I didn't recognize. "Of course it's good news," Amber said quickly, though her tone suggested otherwise. "It's just that we'd hoped, well, this seemed like it might be the perfect opportunity to discuss more supportive living arrangements. Somewhere with medical staff available and better safety protocols. The perfect opportunity." She had been hoping my stroke would be severe enough to justify moving me into assisted care, eliminating the need for further negotiations about my relocation. My medical emergency had been viewed not as a frightening reminder of my mortality, but as a convenient solution to her housing problem. Maybe you could speak to the social worker about her capacity for independent living, the other voice suggested. Sometimes families need professional help determining what's really safest for elderly relatives. Professional help determining what's safest. They were discussing strategies for having my competence evaluated by hospital staff who might recommend supervised care, using my stroke as evidence that I could no longer manage independent living safely. The Concerned Daughter Act had been preparation for this moment, when she could point to her attentive care, as evidence of her suitability as my decision-maker. I've already scheduled a meeting, Amber replied. The key is presenting it as concern for her welfare, rather than convenience for us. But given her age and this health scare, I think we have a strong case for arguing that she needs more support than she's willing to admit. More support than she's willing to admit. They were planning to use my stroke as leverage to override my preferences about my own care, framing my desire for independence as dangerous stubbornness that required professional intervention to overcome. The conversation continued for several more minutes, during which Amber outlined her strategy for convincing medical staff that I was incapable of making rational decisions about my living situation. She had researched the legal processes for obtaining guardianship, identified healthcare professionals who might support her position, and prepared arguments about my isolation and vulnerability that would make institutional care seem like the responsible choice. When she returned to my room 10 minutes later, her face was composed in the same expression of loving concern she'd been maintaining throughout my hospitalization. "How are you feeling, Mom?" she asked, smoothing my blanket with gentle efficiency. "The nurses say you're making excellent progress." "Much better," I said, watching her face carefully for any sign that she knew I'd overheard her conversation. "The doctors think I'll be able to go home soon." "That's wonderful news," she said, though I could see the calculation behind her smile. "Of course, we'll need to make some adjustments to ensure your safety. Maybe install some grab bars, remove those scatter rugs that could be trip hazards, perhaps arrange for someone to check on you regularly." Safety adjustments, trip hazards, regular check-ins. She was already laying the groundwork for arguing that my home was unsuitable for someone recovering from a stroke, creating a paper trail of safety concerns that could support her case for relocating me to supervised care. "I've been thinking," she continued, settling into the chair beside my bed with the posture of someone preparing for a serious discussion. "This health scare has really made me realize how important it is for you to have medical support readily available. There are some wonderful facilities that specialize in stroke recovery and ongoing care." Wonderful facilities specializing in stroke recovery. She was using my temporary vulnerability as an opportunity to revive her relocation campaign with medical justification. The month of respectful treatment had been preparation for this moment, when she could present herself as the devoted daughter-in-law whose only concern was my welfare. But what she didn't realize was that I'd been taking notes throughout her performance, both literally and figuratively. Every conversation, every manipulation, every calculated kindness had been catalogued with the same attention to detail I brought to plotting my novels. And now I had one final chapter to write. One that would reveal exactly who had been controlling this story all along. The stroke had been a setback, but it had also been an education. I now understood the true scope of Amber's ambitions and the extent to which she was willing to exploit my vulnerability to achieve her goals. More importantly, I understood that no amount of respectful treatment could erase the fundamental truth about who she was and what she wanted. It was time to deliver the ending this story deserved. I returned home from the hospital on a Friday afternoon in late November, armed with a clean bill of health and a crystal-clear understanding of exactly what kind of family I was dealing with. The doctors had pronounced my recovery remarkable, my cognitive function unimpaired, and my capacity for independent living completely intact. But Amber greeted this news with the kind of smile people wear when they're trying to look pleased about something that has ruined their carefully laid plans. The house felt different when I walked through the front door, not physically changed, but somehow smaller, as if the walls had contracted while I was away. It took me several minutes to identify the source of my unease, and when I did, the discovery was both shocking and illuminating. My bedroom had been converted. Not completely, and not obviously. My furniture remained in place, my personal belongings were exactly where I'd left them. But subtle changes revealed the true scope of what had happened during my 5-day absence. A baby monitor sat on my nightstand. Safety rails had been installed along the bathroom walls. The scatter rugs Amber had mentioned as trip hazards had been removed and replaced with industrial-grade grippy mats that belonged in a medical facility rather than a private home. Most telling of all, a hospital bed had been set up in the corner of my room, still in its delivery packaging but clearly intended for immediate use. The setup was perfect. It would allow Amber to point to all these safety improvements as evidence of her thoughtful preparation for my return, while simultaneously demonstrating that my bedroom was being transformed into a medical care environment rather than a private sanctuary. "We wanted to make sure you'd be comfortable and safe," Amber explained when she saw me surveying the changes. "The physical therapist recommended some modifications, and we thought it would be better to have everything ready before you came home." The physical therapist had made no such recommendations. I'd spoken with her myself about my discharge plans, and she'd been quite clear that I needed no special equipment or environmental modifications. But Amber's version would sound convincing to anyone who hadn't been present for the actual medical consultations. "I appreciate the thought," I said carefully, "but I don't think I'll be needing most of these adjustments. My recovery has been better than expected." Her face flickered with something that might have been disappointment before reassembling into an expression of loving concern. "Of course, Mom, but it's better to have the safety equipment and not need it than to need it and not have it. We just want to be prepared for any setbacks." Any setbacks. She was hoping for setbacks, planning for complications that might justify the medical supervision she wanted to impose. The loving daughter performance was continuing, but now I could see the infrastructure she'd built to support her next phase of manipulation. That evening, during what she announced would be a quiet family dinner to celebrate your homecoming, the final revelation came. I was helping clear the table, demonstrating my perfectly functional motor skills and cognitive ability, when I overheard Amber speaking quietly to Tobias in the kitchen. "The guardianship lawyer says we need documented evidence of impaired judgment or unsafe behavior," she was saying, her voice barely above a whisper. "One stroke episode isn't enough, but if we can show a pattern of poor decision-making or risky choices, we might have a case." Guardianship lawyer, pattern of poor decision-making. They were actively consulting legal counsel about having me declared incompetent, building a case to strip away my autonomy and decision-making authority. The safety modifications weren't about my welfare, they were props in a legal strategy designed to prove I needed supervised care. "What kind of evidence?" Tobias asked. "Anything that suggests she can't manage her own affairs safely. Unpaid bills, missed appointments, medication errors, falls, confusion about dates or finances." The lawyer says family members often have to intervene when elderly relatives refuse to acknowledge their limitations. They were discussing strategies for manufacturing evidence of my incompetence, creating incidents they could point to as proof that I was no longer capable of managing my own life. The devoted care they'd been providing was actually surveillance, waiting for mistakes they could document or problems they could create. The woman who had dismissed my literary achievements as little stories was now consulting attorneys about how to legally eliminate my right to make decisions about my own life. The daughter-in-law who had spent months serving me leftovers while dining on prime rib was preparing to take control of the fortune that had funded her comfortable lifestyle. Standing in my own kitchen, listening to my family plot my legal imprisonment, I realized that this story had reached its climax. The mask had finally dropped completely, revealing the true nature of the people I'd been sharing my home with for the past 18 months. They wanted to declare me incompetent to manage my own affairs. They thought I was too confused and diminished to make rational decisions about my own life. Tomorrow, I would show them exactly how sharp my decision-making abilities really were. The next morning, I called Louis Rudd and asked him to meet me at the house. Not at his office, not at some neutral location, but in my own home where Amber and Tobias could witness the final chapter of the story they thought they were writing. I wanted them to see exactly what kind of decision-making capacity I possessed, and I wanted them to understand that their months of manipulation had been observed, cataloged and legally documented. Louis arrived at 10 o'clock sharp, carrying the leather portfolio that had become as familiar to me as my own writing tools. He was dressed in his best suit, lending an air of formality to what I knew would be the most important legal meeting of my life. When I opened the door to greet him, Amber and Tobias were in the living room, looking curious but not particularly concerned about why my attorney might be visiting on a Saturday morning. "Good morning, Mrs. Stewart," Lewis said, his voice carrying the professional gravity that came with significant legal business. "I have all the documents you requested, properly executed and witnessed according to your instructions." "Wonderful," I replied, leading him into the living room where my family waited. "I thought it would be appropriate to handle this business in front of everyone who will be affected by these decisions." Amber looked up from the baby name book she'd been browsing, her expression shifting from mild curiosity to something approaching alarm. "What kind of business, Mom? Is everything all right?" "Everything is exactly as it should be," I said, settling into my favorite chair while Louis arranged his papers on the coffee table with methodical precision. "I've been making some important decisions about my estate planning, and I wanted to share the details with both of you." The word estate seemed to galvanize their attention. Suddenly, the baby name book was forgotten, and both Amber and Tobias were focused entirely on the legal documents. Louis was organizing with practiced efficiency. "Given my recent health scare," I continued, "I realized it was important to ensure my affairs are properly arranged. I wouldn't want there to be any confusion about my intentions or my capacity to make these kinds of decisions." My capacity to make decisions, the phrase hung in the air like a challenge, and I watched Amber's face as she realized I might know more about their legal consultations than they had assumed. "Of course," she said carefully, "it's always good to have things properly documented. We want to make sure your wishes are clear and legally sound." "I'm so glad you feel that way," I replied, "because I've made some very clear decisions about how I want my estate distributed." "Louis, would you please explain the current terms of my will?" Louis cleared his throat and began reading from the legal documents with the same professional tone he'd used for countless other estate planning meetings. But I knew that for Amber and Tobias, this would be unlike any legal proceeding they'd ever experienced. "The last will and testament of Dolores Stewart," he began, "being of sound mind and body, makes the following provisions for the distribution of her estate, valued at approximately $30 million. $30 million. The number seemed to reverberate through the room like a physical presence. I watched Amber's face go pale as she processed not just the amount, but the implications of what she was about to hear. "To the National Literacy Foundation," Louis continued, "Mrs. Stewart bequeaths the sum of $29,700,000 to be used for establishing reading programs in underserved communities across the United States." The silence that followed was profound. Amber's mouth opened slightly, as if she were trying to speak, but couldn't quite form words. Tobias sat completely still, his face frozen in an expression of shocked disbelief. "To her daughter Amber Stewart Sanders, and her son-in-law Tobias Sanders," Louis read on, "Mrs. Stewart leaves the remainder of her estate, consisting of approximately $300,000, and any personal property not otherwise specified. $300,000, 1% of my total estate." The mathematical precision of the insult was unmistakable, and I could see the moment when Amber realized that her inheritance represented exactly the same proportion of consideration she'd been showing me. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "There must be some mistake." "There's no mistake," I said calmly. "You're receiving exactly what your behavior has earned. 1% of my estate, which represents the same percentage of respect you've shown me over the past 18 months. The truth had finally been revealed, and the look on their faces told me they understood exactly what kind of story they'd been living in all along. "But Louis," continued, his voice maintaining its professional steadiness despite the emotional storm erupting in my living room, "Mrs. Stewart has also prepared a letter, explaining her reasoning, which she has requested be read as part of these proceedings." He opened the sealed envelope I had prepared months earlier, back when I first began to understand the true nature of my family's intentions. The letter I was about to hear would connect every slight, every dismissal, every leftover meal to the inheritance they were receiving. "To my dear daughter Amber and son-in-law Tobias," Louis read, I want you to understand that the distribution of my estate reflects precisely the same level of consideration you have shown me during our time living together. Amber's hands were shaking now, gripping the arms of her chair, as if she were trying to anchor herself against the reality of what she was hearing. Tobias sat in stunned silence, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, anger, and dawning comprehension. For 18 months you served me leftover food while you and your guests enjoyed fresh meals, purchased with my money. You dismissed my literary achievements as little stories while benefiting from the income they generated. You planned my displacement from my own home while consulting lawyers about declaring me incompetent to manage my own affairs. The last phrase hit like a physical blow. Louis' voice remained neutral, but I could see the recognition in their faces. They understood that I had known about their legal consultations, their guardianship strategies, their plans to strip away my autonomy. You treated me as if I were worth leftovers, the letter continued, so your inheritance consists of the leftover portion of my estate after I have properly honored organizations that actually valued my contributions. The National Literacy Foundation will receive the main course of my legacy because they understand the true value of literature and learning. Amber finally found her voice, though it came out as little more than a whisper. Mom, you can't be serious. We're family. We love you. Everything we did was because we were worried about you. Were you worried about me? I asked. Or were you worried about your access to my house and my money? Because there's a significant difference between those two concerns. The distinction was crucial, and we all knew it. Their worry had been entirely self-serving, focused on securing their own comfort rather than ensuring my welfare. Every expression of concern had been calculated to achieve their desired outcome, my displacement, rather than emerging from genuine care for my happiness. The letter continues, Louis said, drawing attention back to the legal document. I have observed your behavior with the same attention to detail I brought to my writing career. Every conversation, every manipulation, every attempt to make me feel like a burden in my own home has been carefully documented. Documented. The word carried legal weight that made Tobias straighten in his chair. I had been more than just a victim of their manipulation. I had been a researcher, collecting evidence of their behavior with the methodical precision of a mystery writer plotting a complex conclusion. You wanted to declare me incompetent to manage my own affairs, I said, standing up and walking to the window that overlooked the garden where I planned to spend my remaining years. This will and this letter demonstrate exactly how competent I am. I've outmaneuvered you at every turn and you never even realized you were being outplayed. The truth was settling over them like snow, cold, comprehensive, and impossible to ignore. They had spent months treating me like a confused elderly woman who could be easily manipulated, never suspecting that I was documenting their behavior for precisely this moment. The house, of course, will be sold upon my death, I continued, with the proceeds going to the Literacy Foundation. They'll use it to establish a writer's retreat for emerging authors, people who understand that literature isn't just formulaic entertainment for the masses. The house they had planned to inherit, the home they had been systematically claiming as their own, would become a sanctuary for the kind of writers they had dismissed as artistically worthless. The irony was perfect, and I could see from their faces that they understood the poetic justice of my decision. You're receiving exactly what you gave me, I said, turning back to face them. The leftover portions served with the same level of consideration you showed me. 1% of my estate, which represents 1% of the respect you demonstrated during our time together. The mathematical precision of the consequence was inescapable. They were inheriting their own behavior, measured out in exact proportion to the dignity they had accorded me. 6 months later, I sit in my garden on a warm spring morning, watching the roses Henry planted bloom for another season. The house is quiet now, peacefully quiet, not the tense silence that had characterized those 18 months of manipulation and pretense. Amber and Tobias moved out 3 days after the will reading, taking their boxes of baby supplies and their shattered assumptions about easy inheritance with them. They found a modest apartment across town, one that fits their actual budget rather than the lifestyle they'd been living on my generosity. Tobias took a second job to help cover their expenses, finally understanding what it meant to work for everything you have, rather than expecting it to be provided. Amber returned to work earlier than planned, leaving their daughter in daycare, while she tried to rebuild the financial security she'd lost through her own miscalculations. The baby, my granddaughter, was born in February. They named her Clara, after my mother, in what I suspect was a last-ditch attempt to appeal to my sentimental side. I visit her once a week, bringing gifts and spending time with a child who will grow up knowing her grandmother loved her enough to ensure her future, even when her parents had forgotten how to value the people who made their comfort possible. Because that's the other part of my story that Amber and Tobias never learned about. Hidden within the complex trust structures Louis had created was a substantial education fund for Clara, one that would become available when she turned 18, regardless of how her parents managed their modest inheritance. She would have choices they never provided me, opportunities that couldn't be taken away by other people's poor decisions. The National Literacy Foundation has been transforming the bulk of my estate into programs that would have made my writing career feel worthwhile, even if I'd never sold a single book. Reading programs in underserved communities, writing workshops for aspiring authors, and scholarships for students who understand that literature isn't just entertainment, it's a way of understanding the human condition. Most satisfying of all, they've established the Dolores Stewart Writers' Retreat in the house that Amber and Tobias had planned to inherit. Young mystery writers gather here now, sitting in the library where I wrote my final novel, working at the desk where I plotted the most complex mystery of my career. The one where the victim turned out to be the mastermind all along. Sometimes the most powerful endings aren't about revenge, they're about proportion, about giving people exactly what they've earned, measured out in the same careful portions they chose to provide. Amber and Tobias wanted to serve me leftovers while they enjoyed the main course of my generosity. Now they're discovering what it means to live on the leftover portions of the life they thought they were entitled to inherit. The universe, I've learned, has a sense of justice that operates like the best mystery novels, quietly, methodically, and with perfect attention to the details that reveal character. Sometimes the most satisfying plot twists are the ones where everyone gets exactly what they deserve, served with the same care and consideration they demonstrated to others. In the end, I gave them precisely what they gave me, leftovers. Not because I was cruel, but because I was fair. Not because I was vindictive, but because I understood that the most important lessons are taught through consequences that match the actions they're meant to address. They received the leftovers of my fortune because they had convinced me that leftovers were all I was worth. The mathematical precision of that justice feels like the perfect ending to a story that began with prime rib and ended with exactly what it deserved. And every morning, as I tend to Henry's roses and work on my new novel, I'm reminded that the best mysteries are the ones where everyone gets exactly what they've earned, no more, no less, and precisely as much as they valued the people who made their comfort possible. Sometimes the most satisfying revenge is simply arithmetic.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.